I'm Rick Dadarian, and this is Realms of Memory. Since the 1990s, one of the most recent trends in history museums around the globe has been the creation of museums devoted to shameful national histories. From apartheid in South Africa to the genocide in Rwanda, these museums share a conviction that nations can benefit when they confront their darkest chapters. At the community college in the City University of New York, sociologist Amy Sodaro has spent years studying the emergence of these new museums. This is the subject of her first book, Exhibiting Atrocity: Memorial Museums and the Politics of Past Violence. Doing the research for this book, Amy realized that the United States lags far behind this trend. Few American museums take on the challenge of confronting the nation's history of racial violence. All this changed with the creation of 3 new museums devoted to the history of slavery and racial violence. What inspired the creation of these museums, what they hope to achieve, and what success they've enjoyed is the subject of Amy Sodaro's most recent book, Lifting the Shadow: Reshaping Memory, Race, and Slavery in U.S. Museums. Conversation with Amy Sodaro about how some of the nation's newest museums take on the challenge of confronting the history of slavery and racial violence in this episode of Realms of Memory. Amy, welcome to Realms of Memory.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
So at the start of your book, you mentioned that you're focusing on 3 museums in particular, and you make the point that these museums would have been unthinkable just a decade ago. So why would they be unthinkable? What's changed? What made them possible? How are they different from what came before?
So the 3 museums that I'm focused on are the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., the Legacy Museum in Montgomery, Alabama, and Greenwood Rising in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And these 3 museums opened within the last decade. And I think what makes them so new and so different from museums that came before, I think there are a couple of things. So, I mean, first of all, I have to say that the U.S. has a long and rich history of African American history and culture museums. There are over 200 of these kinds of museums. But most of these museums and other like mainstream history museums have tended to focus more on kind of uplifting narratives of racial progress and kind of celebrating African-American achievement in the civil rights movement. And I think what makes these new museums so different is the way they work to really center slavery and racial injustice in U.S. history. And each museum kind of in its own way is working to make this story really an indelible part of the American story and the American experience. And I think this is really new. They also don't avoid confronting the violence of slavery and the injustices of slavery. And I think the other thing that they're doing that departs kind of dramatically from previous museums is the way they work to connect past and present. So, other museums have kind of made the effort to keep the past in the past and to kind of wrap up their stories of slavery and racial injustice and leave that in the past and present the present as, different from what came before. But in these museums, to varying degrees, and we can probably get to some of the differences, they make more of an effort to connect past and present and to show how the history of slavery and its legacies continue to impact African Americans and U.S. society today.
So I thought that was an interesting point that you make, that one of the novelties you're stressing is that they're kind of they're not presenting a typical triumphant history of the country, that they're looking at some of the wrongs, some of the injustices from the past. And if you watch the news, you would think that that's everything that's happening now. So but you read your book, you look at what's actually happening on the ground, this is something new. And most places still aren't doing that, and maybe a handful of places. So it's completely out of sync with what you would think if you're looking at debates or coverage in the media about how our history is being taught.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is, I think that's true to a certain extent of these museums, but they're also part of like a larger shift in the United States. Jeffrey Olick has written about this mnemonic turn in the US over the course of the last decade toward a more kind of honest and critical confrontation with slavery and its legacies. And so I think the museums are part of that shift, which is some of what the backlash that we're seeing today is responding to. And so I, kind of situate them within all of these other things that have been happening, like the toppling of Confederate monuments and a wave of universities trying to reckon with their connections to slavery, and like projects like the 1619 Project. And of course, the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020. And so these museums, I think, are part of a larger shift. But in the world, in the landscape of commemoration, in the world of U.S. museums, I think they represent something really new. And when I was writing the book and when I was finishing the book, I was feeling very optimistic about, where they kind of fit into U.S. commemoration and the commemorative landscape. And then, of course, all of that has come kind of crashing down with this severe backlash that we're seeing. So I think, their newness is part of a larger movement, and it's that whole movement that is really under attack right now.
So you stress that the U.S. is not doing this in isolation, that there's this international trend towards, you mentioned Jeffrey Olick, the politics of regret and moral remembrance, that the past, the relationship between the past and national histories and museums is undergoing a fundamental change. So what is this change? But you do point out too that the U.S. is late to the party. That if it's joining in, it wasn't at the forefront of what's happening.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, this politics of regret was kind of a framing for my first book about memorial museums, which looked at kind of the global spread of these kinds of museums and this shift toward a more an effort to more critically confront past violence, often in a way that, was sort of meant to be implicating the state in the perpetration of that violence. But the U.S. was kind of behind in that sort of initial rush to commemorate around the world. And so I had, included a couple of U.S. case studies in that first book, but part of what drove me to write this new book was that as I was working on that book, as I was writing about these memorial museums and this new trend in commemoration, I was just really struck by the lack of that kind of commemoration in the U.S., that there was no slavery museum, that the U.S. was, like sort of pushing other nations to confront their past violence vis-a-vis this politics of regret, but kind of refusing to confront our own. And I think that had kind of started to shift with these new museums that I write about in this book, that I think are very much part of that movement. But now we're, seeing a very clear backlash to this politics of regret in the U.S. and really around the globe.
It's the time of no regrets
Exactly.
right now. And there are people that you spot like Brian Stevenson. You talk about the Legacy Museum and who are really inspired by what's happening elsewhere, or realizing, why isn't there more of this going on in the U.S.?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Brian Stevenson especially points to, in particular, Germany, looking at Holocaust commemoration in Germany, and especially in Berlin with the Holocaust Memorial. He points to South Africa. He points to Rwanda as places that really have made concerted efforts to confront the past. And I know we can critique these efforts, and there are a lot of limitations to what these nations and collectives have done to confront their pasts. But he certainly was inspired by their efforts. And the other museums that I write about in the book were also, to varying degrees, looking to these international memorial efforts that were really shaped by this politics of regret, and trying to, kind of bring that ethos to commemoration of slavery and its legacies in the United States. So we were kind of late to the game of commemoration vis-a-vis the politics of regret. So late to the point where now it's kind of up in the air where this shift is heading.
So there's been a lot of coverage in the news because of the jewelry heist at the Louvre, but that's kind of the traditional museum where you go and there's a massive collection of objects, right? And you appreciate the nation's culture, and you have maybe a story of how the nation came to be. But museums now are supposed to be there. There's a kind of moral redemption. There's an effort to try to transform the visitor. And all of that is something that's new. And I had Leah David on the podcast a few episodes back, and that was her point, that really grows out of the Nuremberg trials, the post-World War II context, the whole idea that these institutions should educate and transform.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's, it's certainly, I think this new sort of role that museums are expected to play, in particular memorial museums and memory museums, comes out of efforts to, come to terms with especially the Holocaust, but also other 20th century genocides and atrocities. But museums have also been changing. And so there's kind of an intersection of these efforts to confront the past and changing roles of museums, as museums have, shifted away from being, as you said, these, and there still are plenty of these museums, but even those museums that are meant to celebrate national culture are realizing that they need to be more kind of responsive and participatory in regard to the communities and the nations that they're operating in. And so museums have been kind of working to, democratize and open up to community and participation. And so I think we see this kind of intersection of the shifting ideas about what museums are supposed to do together with these efforts to confront past violence. And so the Memorial Museum has become, an institution for trying to do these two things at once. And they're also, I think I just have to say, they're very popular as tourist attractions. They, tend to attract big audiences and a lot of interest and excitement. And so I think that is driving this as well. I think, in all of the museums that I write about in this book, a part of what they're responding to and what they're intending to do is to bring in visitors and, in the case especially of Montgomery and Tulsa, to like revitalize these downtown areas and really contribute to, urban renewal and development and so on.
Now, that part I thought was fascinating because on the one hand, there's this backlash about what's being taught in schools and books, that should we keep them in school libraries, and what should you be teaching to students at all levels, yet. And a lot of this is kind of based on this conviction that we need to tell a story that's more uplifting, that we shouldn't burden people with shame and guilt about things that happened in the past. But when you actually look at these museums that you feature, the handful that take on these difficult histories, people are flocking to them. They are bringing in some serious dollars into those communities.
Yeah, they really are. And of course, we always have to remember, and I think this is something that all of us who, research these kinds of museums are always like kind of haunted by. Like, of course, it's a self-selecting crowd for the most part that visits these museums. The exception would be, especially school groups who come in for visits. But even with this in mind, I think the popularity of these museums is really important to note. The National Museum of African American History and Culture, for example, is free to visit, but you have to reserve tickets in advance. And generally, tickets are gone like kind of instantly. You need to like be on the website like a month before you want to visit to like make sure you get your reservation, to be assured of like being able to visit when you want to. The Legacy Museum has brought, hundreds of thousands of visitors to Montgomery and completely like is helping to revitalize the downtown of that city. So I think their popularity, despite everything that's going on around us politically and socially, is really notable. And I think, maybe like the silver lining that I sometimes hope to see as I think about what's going on is that as books are banned and classroom teaching is controlled, like maybe museums become an even more important space for learning about these histories. And maybe as, public historical knowledge and memory is more and more constrained, the role of these museums becomes ever more important if they are allowed and able to continue telling their stories.
You make the point that these museums are part of this new context, this new approach to the past that you're seeing in museums around the world. But you stress they're also a break with, they're all museums that feature African American history, and they're a break with the way museums, African American histories dealt with, with that particular past. And you describe these three museums as the third phase of the way museums address that past. So what were these other two phases? What makes the third phase different?
Yeah. So, I mean, the idea of these sort of phases of African American museums really comes from the work of Andrea Burns and Robin Autry, who've both written about African American history and culture museums. And they argue that the first phase began really in the 1960s and consisted of what they refer to as neighborhood museums, kind of small museums that were created in and for African American communities that were intended to kind of counter the mainstream historical narratives in other museums. And so these museums, were intended for these communities, and focused on the history, but also on kind of a celebration of African American resilience and culture and community. The second phase then happens over like the course of the 1980s and 90s. And this is a phase really focused on celebrating and commemorating the civil rights movement. And so many of these projects were part of urban renewal projects aimed at kind of bringing in tourism and tourist dollars to cities, in part by very often taking like sites that were important to the civil rights movement and turning them into museum and memory sites to tell the story of the movement and really to celebrate the successes of the civil rights movement. And so in both of those cases, the museums were really aimed at, stories of racial progress and kind of telling these triumphal stories about, the African American communities overcoming adversity in the past. And so this third phase, as I'm calling these museums in the book, I think depart from this kind of progressive narrative in other museums and turn toward this kind of politics of regret in the way that they present and tell the history and the legacies of slavery. And as I said, I think they're part of this larger shift in the U.S. toward a more open and honest and critical confrontation with this past. And I think, at the heart of them is this belief that like we have to understand, the truth about what happened in the past in order to be able to begin to make change in the present. And so trying to like link the past to the present, refusing to allow the narrative to be kind of neatly tied up as one of progress and triumph. And, in many ways created more, more with the present in mind than with the past, with trying to, grapple with how the past has shaped the present and how understanding that past can help, contribute to social justice in the present.
And also, I think you stress uh, that these earlier phases, these were kind of histories that were being done by minority communities for minority communities. And whereas the museums that you feature are really trying to incorporate that history into America. So this is part of American history and then geared
Absolutely.
towards a much broader audience.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so the way that they are trying to like center this story in the broader, American history and American story. And also, as you say, I think in many ways, how they are telling this story for especially white Americans to end the, sort of ignorance about this history that has, helped contribute to its silencing in many ways in mainstream American history.
But they're all based on this idea that kind of like an Enlightenment idea that if you can just spread education, you can transform people, that you can root out irrational ways of thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is, one of the key tensions that I've always found in memorial museums is, that they, like all of them, have this goal really of social transformation, moral transformation of their visitors. And this, they sort of rest on this belief that through education about the past, we can create a better present and future, which is this very kind of like modern ideal. Whereas the museums themselves and this like politics of regret that, they sort of stem from and reflect and embody is, this kind of repudiation of many of those ideas of modernity and this like recognition that modernity failed us in so many ways and that the modern project, you know, actually ended up more destructive than anyone had ever hoped or imagined. And so I think this is a very real tension in these institutions, and where I see a lot of their shortcomings stemming from just this idealist, image that we have of what we can do with the past and how they're actually able to affect change. And
So just before this, I was listening to an interview with Lonnie Bunch, who's the founding director of the National Museum for African American History and Culture, and he was explaining how he gave this personal guided tour to Donald Trump, 2016, of the museum, and that he was inspired by this idea that this could help broaden education about race relations in the country, and then it's the person interviewing him would say, "Well, what happened?" He's like, "Basically, I was wrong." He said, yeah.
yeah,
And he said he got to the section where he was where they were featuring the Dutch and the history of slavery, and Trump's comment was, "Well, they really love me in the Netherlands." That he wasn't necessarily getting the education that he had hoped for. But since then, now he's the secretary of the Smithsonian. So, and that's impressive. He's still in that position.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, Bunch, I think, his story is amazing. The work that he did on the National Museum of African American History and Culture is really incredible. And I think, the very existence of the museum is really extraordinary. And, you visit the museum and you see the crowds there being so moved by what they see. It's easy to get kind of swept up in, in this idea that these museums can affect change and that they can contribute to social justice. And I think they do have that potential. But then as this, story reminds us, again, these museums tend to serve self-selecting audiences who are open to the stories that they tell. And there are plenty of people who don't visit these museums, in part because they're not open to, learning this history and hearing these stories. And I think that's where we get at least some of this disconnect between what it is that these museums strive to do and, and what sometimes looks like just, an abject failure of their ability to contribute to, social transformation. But I like to stay optimistic and hope that, sort of incrementally, they are contributing.
So, I don't know, this kind of reminds me, I'll listen to sports radio. I'm in the Boston area. Now and then I'll listen to sports radio, and people will call in and they'll say, hey, why are you always so critical of the team? And they'll say, that's our role. That's our job. We have to be. And we're not cheerleaders. We can't just celebrate. And so, I mean, you have to do that yourself. And you point out how these are path-breaking institutions, but you've got to take a critical stance on them. And you're very critical of 2 out of the 3, and my questions are kind of geared towards that, but I don't want to pass over the significance of them. And when I was listening to that Lonnie Bunch interview, he was pointing out that he personally, and you mentioned this in your book, that there was no collection of any. They had to really start from scratch, and that they were inspired by the Antiques Roadshow model. And he was saying that he fell asleep in front of the TV set one day. He woke up and Antiques Roadshow was on. He realized, wait, this could be a good approach to going around and trying to encourage people to take a look. What's in your attic? What's in your basement? What's in that trunk? To look through their own past. And that was the beginning of people, like an outpouring of people offering significant things and from their own families, and something like 70% of the collection of this National Museum is really coming from the African American community.
Absolutely, yes, and I'm definitely critical of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, but I think we absolutely cannot discount just how extraordinary its very existence is. And I think the story of building the collection is part of that. The 3 stories of historical exhibition that present such a detailed and difficult history of slavery in a way that critiques the very foundations of this nation. The story of the civil rights movement. I think all of this is, as I've said, unprecedented and like really extraordinary, to be located on the National Mall, to be telling this story. And my main area of critique, or my main point of critique, is, I think very much kind of a case of hindsight is 2020. And my primary critique of the museum is the ending of the historical exhibition, because it ends with the election of Obama in 2008. And so, this very long history that the visitor has been told, and you sort of trek through 3 stories of this very difficult history. It ends with the election of Obama and these massive photos of the inauguration and the celebration of the election of America's first Black president. And so the suggestion, of course, is that, this is the culmination of that history, that, all of this injustice has been overcome, that we've kind of moved to what some people were talking about as like a post-racial America with the election of Obama. And of course, when the museum opened, this was September 2016, I think probably many people involved in its creation, many supporters, assumed that Hillary Clinton was going to be elected and kind of continue the legacy of Obama. And just a month and a half later, Trump was elected, and, we've seen, this like major kind of shift away from, that fallacy of like post-racial America that people had hoped we were witnessing toward what Alison Landsberg writes about as post-racial America, and this, backlash against all of that kind of history telling. So while I am critical of the museum, I think I just can't say enough just how important and extraordinary its existence is. And I think we're seeing that importance now in the attacks by the Trump administration, specifically on that museum and on the way it presents the history of slavery in this country.
So the other museum that you tend to be more critical of is the Greenwood Rising. So what story does that tell? Where did you feel that it fell short?
Yeah, so Greenwood Rising opened in 2021 for the centennial commemoration of the Tulsa Race Massacre. And so it's different from the other two museums in that it focuses on a very particular, historical event that is, located in this that occurred in this neighborhood where the museum is located. And so it's telling a much more kind of specific history. And when the museum opened, there were still living survivors of the massacre. I think today 2 might still be alive. I think a couple more were alive when the museum opened. And so the museum, was created and opened in the context of, still a living memory of the Tulsa Race Massacre. And so I think that's where a lot of like sort of issues for that museum arise. So a commission was formed to like plan out the centennial commemoration. And the commission decided to put most of its effort into the creation of a museum. And as we've been talking about, museums are considered these great institutions for like confronting the past and educating and transforming society. And so I think it's a decision that makes sense in a lot of ways. But, all of their fundraising went into the creation of this museum. The museum opened in the Greenwood neighborhood, which had been destroyed in the massacre, which had been like a thriving and vibrant Black community, and which has been undergoing gentrification. And so the neighborhood is now getting kind of trendy, but it's a lot of like white-owned businesses. A lot of African-American families have been pushed out of the neighborhood. And in the process of creating the museum, the living survivors, some of the descendants of the massacre, were left out of the process. They tried to make it a kind of open and participatory process, and they invited community to, weigh in on plans for the museum, but left out some of the key stakeholders in many ways. And so the survivors, many descendants, many in the African American community felt like the museum was not for them, that it was really kind of created for tourists and to revitalize this neighborhood that no longer was a neighborhood for them. And they felt that the money spent on the museum would have been better spent on reparations for survivors. There were never any reparations. There was never any restitution. The economic impacts of the massacre are, clearly evident in Tulsa even to this day. And so many in the African American community felt like this was kind of another form of betrayal to like raise all of this money to create this like sort of sleek and shiny new museum in this gentrifying neighborhood that really wasn't for them and that didn't address like the very real, immediate material and emotional and social needs of the community that had been really destroyed by this massacre. And so I think it's, a different set of critiques that I have of the Greenwood Rising Museum that are very much related to, kind of the ongoing and felt like living memory of the Tulsa Race Massacre.
So it's interesting. So these museums can bring dollars into communities. They can tell difficult histories in unlikely places. But those dollars don't necessarily benefit the community, or at least the community could look at that and see it as just part of a gentrification process.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the creators of Greenwood Rising really looked to the Legacy Museum for inspiration. And they especially saw how the museum was contributing to bringing in those tourist dollars and revitalizing downtown Montgomery. And they, envisioned a museum that could do the same for Tulsa. But, unlike the Legacy Museum, Greenwood Rising was kind of the culmination of the work of commemorating the Tulsa Race Massacre. And so all of this, energy and effort and money went into the centennial commemoration that kind of ended with the creation of this museum, which, yes, is probably bringing in tourist dollars to the neighborhood, but the neighborhood is kind of no longer a neighborhood where many African American families can live or own businesses or, really access in many ways. And so I feel like in many ways the creators, kind of approached the museum with all of the best intentions, but sort of ended up missing the mark on some of these really important, issues that these museums have to address and be able to deal with, especially related to their stakeholders and the question of who the museum is for.
And you make this point about outreach as well, that if memorial museums are new in that they try to implicate the visitor, and they try to target a broader public, they try to target the white visitors and to try to affect them, change them, to want them to encourage them to go out and make the world a better place. Uh, um, you're very critical of this museum in not really doing a whole lot to provide opportunities for that.
Yeah. I mean, I think the museum, in the book I write about like all of these ways that it really does try to implicate white visitors, right? It kind of checks all these boxes, but it doesn't really provide any actual sort of material, practical ways that visitors could begin to kind of affect change. And I think that's what sets the Legacy Museum apart, because that museum, was created by the Equal Justice Initiative. And they are first and foremost a legal advocacy group. Like that's the major work that they do is like working for, justice in the legal criminal system. And the museum is kind of part of that work, but not the main focus. And so it's part of like a constellation of, their activism in the justice system, in the communities in which they operate. Whereas Greenwood Rising, tells this history, sort of makes the effort to connect past and present. But the kind of only opportunity it gives to visitors, for any kind of reflection or action related to the story that they've heard, is to write a commitment to racial justice, right? That can be like projected on this beautiful commitment wall in the museum. And that, I mean, I think that can have meaning for some people, but there's this great term, and I'm forgetting where it comes from, to describe that kind of activism, slacktivism, right? Where you're able to kind of feel like you are making some kind of change, but not actually having to do anything. And so I think the museum kind of builds up this feeling of implication, but then doesn't sort of give visitors any outlet for any kind of efforts at rectifying the past. And in Tulsa in particular, I think there are very like sort of clear material ways that this could start to happen, like especially through, some form of reparation, some form of economic compensation for the communities that continue to be affected by the massacre.
Okay. So if you're going to try to implicate the visitor, you stress one of the things these museums do is they use a lot of new technology to try to do this, and that traditionally museums have been all about objects. And these museums often don't have a lot of objects. So maybe the National Museum for African American History and Culture is different. There it does. But often for the other two, they rely more on technology to make the case. And you stress, well, technology can be more or less effective, and you tend just to focus on the Legacy Museum as using technology much more effectively. So how is it more effective there? What makes it resonate, in your opinion, with visitors?
Yeah, so both the Legacy Museum and Greenwood Rising have very little in the way of like collections. And so they turn to, as you said, technology to help tell their stories. And both of them use, kind of like holographic representations of people from the past. And both of them kind of embed these kinds of encounters in their exhibitions. But I think what sets the Legacy Museum apart is so there are these sort of two encounters that visitors have. One is in the slave pen exhibit, where these, like holographic images of enslaved people speak to the visitor. The other comes at the end of a visit, where the visitor sits down in kind of a simulated prison visitation room and like picks up a phone and speaks to an incarcerated individual. And so these encounters are kind of parallel, where the visitor has the opportunity, to sort of speak to these voices that have been discarded and silenced in the past and in the present, in these, individuals who are incarcerated. And I think that's very powerful to, not only have the opportunity to, feel as if one is being addressed by these individuals who, whose voices have been kind of lost to us, but also making that connection again between past and present, and sort of reminding the visitor that, even today, there are, big groups of our population whose voices are being discarded and silenced. The Greenwood Rising, uses these sort of holographic images in their recreation of a barbershop, and it's a really kind of innovative, interesting, experiential encounter for visitors. But visitors are just like observing. They're not spoken to. They are not really, addressed in any way by these individuals. And so I think something is kind of lost there, where they're not sort of drawn into feeling any kind of connection or responsibility for what it is that they're learning about. The other thing that I'll say about the Legacy Museum's technology, there are those two encounters that I mentioned, but then a lot of the museum is like touch screens and interactive maps where visitors can kind of look up additional information. And I think this is really powerful because all of it comes from very extensive historical research that EJI has conducted that forms like the foundation of the museum and the narrative that it's telling. And so EJI has been documenting lynchings across the country, and today has documented around 6,500 lynchings. It's kind of the definitive record of lynching in America. And so there are these like interactive maps where visitors can like look up counties and see how many lynchings occurred there. And so I think this technology is effective and important because it is rooted in so much extensive detailed, historical research that just has not been done in American historiography. And so I think, with the Legacy Museum, technology has been kind of harnessed to, you know, present this extensive historical record, and also to place some kind of like responsibility on visitors for, making these connections and feeling some kind of, ethical commitment to what it is that they're learning about. And I think that's just kind of missing in Greenwood Rising.
So, and I think with the Legacy Museum, you stress that the EJI, the Equal Justice Initiative, offers this kind of foundation of authority that you just can't replicate anywhere else. I mean, it is really unique. So, on the one hand, the work that it does is inspirational and can offset a really difficult history. And the case that it makes, you find it to be very effective. So, how does it approach the past based on the background of who the people are in the Equal Justice Initiative?
Yeah, so I mean, it's such an interesting kind of outlier when it comes to museums in general, because the Legacy Museum was created by the Equal Justice Initiative, really by a team of attorneys. They brought in very few museum professionals, did so much of the exhibition design and narrative themselves, and so they have very strong control over the narrative and the story that they're telling. And I should pause here to make the very important point that they're entirely privately funded. And so, unlike the Smithsonian Museum, unlike Greenwood Rising, they are not beholden to any kind of political pressures in the same way. And so, they are kind of free to tell the story that they want. And that story was really created by attorneys who, their starting point was witnessing, inequality and injustice, especially along racial lines in the criminal justice system, and realizing that the roots of this inequality go so deep that you can't really understand what's going on today without understanding slavery and segregation and lynching and like the long history of racial injustice. And so, they put together this museum to tell this story, to kind of bring this historical understanding to the public. And they put it together in the way that one might make a legal argument. And so it's very, they present a lot of evidence. It is very persuasive, the way they tell this story, in a way that I think of as like kind of legalistic, right? It's like, when you sort of think about who created it, very like clearly it was lawyers who were making, the kind of argument that you might make in the courtroom to prove their point. And I think it ends up being extremely effective, in, in compelling visitors to, follow the argument from point A to B to C, and realizing, just how much continuity there is from past to present. But again, without having that kind of, control over the narrative, without having that kind of independence from, political and other social entities. I think it's really an outlier in many ways in how it's able to construct an argument and tell it.
That's interesting. So I'm thinking, as you're talking about lawyers making a case and letting the evidence speak, I'm thinking of this episode that I had on forensics and memory in the Spanish Civil War. And it was that approach. You take a really divisive past that people haven't dealt with, and you literally dig it up, just like the Legacy Museum is digging up has those soil samples in hundreds of jars to remind people of that past that they haven't confronted. You're digging up the bones of these people who were shot and killed and buried dumped in mass graves, and graves were not like, it's not that disappeared. Everyone knows where they are in Spain. They litter the
Yeah.
countryside.
Yeah.
But in digging them up, you open up a story and you let the evidence of the bones speak, and you can see where the bullet wound is. You can see the woman's earring. You can, people gather around from communities where they didn't talk about that past, and you let the evidence open a conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is, what kind of drives the storytelling in the Legacy Museum. Um, and I think that's what makes it so powerful. But I think it also, I think this is true also of these forensic efforts around the Spanish Civil War. I think the museum itself is not the endpoint or culmination. It's part of this constellation of other work that's being done. And so it's together with the memorial and now the sculpture park, it's kind of the main place that the public, can learn this history. But EJI is doing so much other work. I think that also lends to the power of the museum in a way that you just don't see in Greenwood Rising, where the museum is meant to be kind of the culmination and the end of the process of doing this memory work.
So where do you come down yourself? And I know you have a section where you use TripAdvisor, and you explain, well, the museums don't really make it possible to do surveys to try to get a real sense of how people experience that history, the way it's told. But from your perspective, I mean, do you feel like this transformative potential is really there, or it's just impossible to tell? Where do you come down on this? Do you see these museums as being the wave of things to come, or just a blip, and we're basically going back to the past and doing history the way it was done in museums in the past?
I think that they do have some transformative potential. Unfortunately, it's so hard to try to study that and measure that and see how that might, actually manifest in visitors. But I think there is that potential. I think it's being threatened right now, very much, by the Trump administration's efforts to whitewash history. And I don't know what this is going to mean, in the immediate future and in the longer term. But as I said, I have some hope that museums like this, and history museums, their work will become kind of more important than ever as, people turn to them to learn about these pasts that are being censored and silenced in other spheres. So I do think they have this potential. My hope is that as an academic, I am far more critical than most visitors are, and that the things that I'm pointing to aren't really undermining the importance of the stories that they're telling to visitors. And so, that is my hope. At the same time, I'm pretty realistic about, understanding that even when somebody raves about a museum on TripAdvisor and talks about how their perspective has changed, that, the likelihood of that, manifesting in any kind of real material, practical change is probably not that high. But I think, if these museums can be part of other societal efforts and processes to make changes, then I think there is a lot of potential. And I think that's why I always kind of come back to the Legacy Museum and the broader work that EJI is doing, to think about like where maybe the greatest potential lies when, when these museums are also part of other activist efforts to actually make changes in our society.
Amy, thank you so much for talking with me. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
I've been talking with Amy Sodaro about her most recent book, Lifting the Shadow, Reshaping Memory, Race, and Slavery in U.S. Museums. If you've enjoyed this or other episodes of Realms of Memory, subscribe on our YouTube channel, send a link to a friend or family member, and review us wherever you can. I'm Rick Dadarian. Thanks for listening.